Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Objective 11.1, Mendel. Describe Mendel's contributions to genetics. Here's a picture of Gregor Mendel. He is famous because he was the first person to really use a scientific approach to try to figure out how traits are inherited or how traits are passed along from generation to generation. And he spent 7 years of his life breeding pea plants to be able to study this. He was a monk, and that picture there is of the pea plants that he used. He used pea plants because they were readily available, they were cheap and easy to get, and also they reproduced quickly, which allowed him to study multiple generations fast. And they also had a lot of different traits, like the flowers could be white or purple, and the plants themselves could be tall or short. Mendel understood that there was something that passes traits from one generation to the next, and he's trying to figure out what that something is. He used the word factors, like he would say a mom passes a factor to its baby. Today, we would call that genes. So he basically discovered genes, which he called factors. Here's a close up of the pea plant. And pea plants are special because they have both male and female parts. The male part there is the pollen. If you have allergies, like the pollen gets in your nose and makes you sneeze. For Mendel's experiment, he had to do cross-pollination because he needed to control which plants were mating. So he used a paintbrush to actually take the pollen from one plant and put it onto the pollen of another plant. And notice that he removed that plant's own pollen so it couldn't self-pollinate. Here's a summary of all the different characteristics he observed. So you can see variation of seed shape, seed color, seed coat, etc. Let's take a plant with seed color. So Mendel cross-pollinated a plant with yellow seeds with a plant with green seeds, and he saw that all of the offspring were yellow. What can we conclude from this? We cross yellow, we cross green, all of them are yellow. Mendel concluded that one of the colors, the yellow color, must be dominant over the green color. Because the yellow cover showed up, it's dominant. Because the green is covered up or masked, it's the recessive trait. This led him to one of his most famous conclusions, known as the principle of dominance. So some alleles are dominant, some are recessive. If an organism has even one dominant allele, it will show that trait. An organism will only show a recessive trait if it doesn't have the dominant alleles. Here's an example of that. You could have two dominant alleles, that would be homozygous dominant, and you would show the dominant trait. Or over here, this individual only has one dominant allele, but it still shows up as yellow. So it's still hiding that recessive trait right here. And then over here, two recessive alleles, this is the only way to show the recessive phenotype. Here's a summary of all of the pea plant characteristics and the results. So down here, all of these are going to be the dominant traits for each one. Let's look at another example. Mendel studied the height of the pea plants, and we call the parent plants up here the pea generation, and we call the offspring the F1, the offspring the F1 generation. So Mendel crossed tall and short plants, and all of the offspring were tall. So that tells us that tall is the dominant trait. We already knew this, we expected this. Now Mendel's going to take it one step further. He's going to let these offspring self-pollinate. So these tall plants are going to reproduce with these tall plants. So here we go from before. There was our F1 offspring, and they reproduced, and here's our outcome. So now we're in the F2 generation. Tall, 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 and a short. This shocked Mendel. I'm sure he thought he made a mistake, and then he redid the whole experiment, because how could you have two parents who are both tall, and then you cross them, and you somehow have an offspring that doesn't look like the parents? That's very weird. What proportion of them were short? 1 out of 4. What proportion were tall? 3 out of 4. Mendel explained this by coming up with the idea of segregation, or the idea that the alleles actually separate. So if the parent had these two alleles, capital B and lowercase b, they separate or segregate into their sex cells. So, like one egg cell would only have one allele, another egg cell could have a different allele. And this means that a parent who was, let's just say, tall, could have an offspring with a tall allele and a short allele. If they stayed together, they could only have the dominant phenotype. But instead, he figured out that they must separate. This is another one of his more famous laws, the principle of segregation, the separation of alleles during gamete formation. A lot of people at the time thought that alleles were blending together. Like if you put a tall with a short, it should make a medium-sized plant. So it's important that we note that segregation kind of tells us that idea is false. And over here, we can see here's the alleles from one plant. There, they're segregating so they can go to all the offspring. Here's the alleles from another plant, and they're segregating to go to all the offspring. That's how two tall plants are able to have a short offspring. I'm going to look at one more example, and this time we're going to study two traits at the same time, seed shape and color. So the shape can either be round or wrinkled, and the round trait is dominant, and the seed color can either be yellow or green, and the yellow trait is dominant. So if you look over here, this is called a Punnett square. How many different combinations do you notice? And by combinations, I mean like this one is round and yellow, but this one happens to be round and green. Over here, like this one is yellow, but it is wrinkled. And then down here, this one is wrinkled and green. So do you see how like all those traits are actually kind of mixing up? It's not like it can only be round and only be yellow. It can be round and yellow or round and green. This led Mendel to his other important conclusion, independent assortment. So, using my same example here of a round yellow plant, independent assortment says that the round and yellow genes are going to separate independently. And what do I mean by that? This R over here could get paired up with either Y. So you could have the capital R going with the capital Y. That could be one possible gamete. Or you could have the capital R going with the lowercase y. There's another gamete for you. And this other allele right here can go with any Y. So you could have little r and big Y, or you can have little r and little y. So all four of these are possible gamete combinations. So independent assortment tells us that the genes for different traits can segregate independently during the formation of gametes. So any one of those four allele combinations would be possible in the sperm and the egg. This explains how genetic variation is possible. Like if you resemble your siblings but you don't look exactly like them, how could that be? Well, it's because your mom's gametes and your dad's gametes assorted independently when they were forming to make you. And I wanted to share this with you. Mendel's genetics research suffers a temporary setback, and you can see all the monks eating there, and the menu says they're eating pea soup. Poor Mendel. Please email me or post questions in that discussion forum. Thanks for listening.